If this were a column, it would be titled Mad at Mandela. In the few years in which I've been a columnist at the Daily Maverick, I've learned a thing or two about anger. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about the issues that I talk about most weeks in my column: race, class, and gender. In particular, today, I wanted to talk about race. So I spent much of this year, I will admit, being mad at this guy. Like most South Africans, I love him. I agree that he's an absolute icon. But given the number of violent racist incidents that have taken place during the course of this year and, of course, the last few years, I found myself wondering whether Nelson Mandela helped us by choosing the path of reconciliation and forgiveness over the path of redistribution and justice. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So, what am I talking about particularly? I think all of us read the news and have seen the headlines. This has been a particularly, I think, difficult year in terms of race relations. So we've had a few incidents of racialized road rage. We've had a number of incidents of blackface on the campus of historically white university campuses. Just last week, we had an appalling event which happened in which a young white man was standing on a balcony and he urinated off the balcony onto somebody who's standing below. And when he was confronted about why he did this, he said, "I don't care if I pee on a black man's head." Yeah? So, not good. And then, of course, we've heard a lot from this guy. Right? He's been tweeting, and he's been busy, and he's been saying things like, black people were the architects of apartheid, and so on. And while it's easy to dismiss him and people like him as lunatics, it's important to remember that Steve Hofmeyr has 122,000 Twitter followers. And it's really important to remember that people show up in large numbers for his concerts. I think he's a singer, right? And so I think it's easy to dismiss that, but I think it's really important to recognize that when we look beyond the headlines and beyond the kind of stuff that we can get carried away with, that the statistics don't look good. So in 2000, the Institute for Race Relations here in South Africa did a survey, and they found that 72% of South Africans across race were feeling pretty good about the direction that we were going. Particularly in regards to how we were beginning to come together, right? And that figure in 2012, a decade and a little bit later, had plummeted to 39%. Yeah? So that's a really disturbing drop. It shows that for a while we were heading in the right direction, and at the moment we're not just heading in the wrong direction, we're heading in the wrong direction pretty fast. A survey that was done here in Gauteng shows similar numbers. In fact, it illustrates that in older townships like this one, so in Mamelodi and Atteridgeville and Soweto, the number of black people who agree with the statement that says, blacks and whites can never trust each other, will never be able to trust each other. The number of black people who agree with that statement in the older townships is between 77 and 100%. So that's a problem. So, back to Mandela. I want to talk about 3 things today, 3 questions. The first question is it fair for us to be mad at him? The second question is, whether or not we agree or disagree about whether we should be mad at him, I think we can all agree that he was an incredibly wise man. And a year after his passing, almost exactly a year after his passing, I think it would be interesting to ask, what would he do today? Not 20 years ago, but what would he do given the record that we've had in the last 20 years? If he were of sound mind and firm body, what would he do? And then the last question, and I think obviously the most important one, is what are we going to do? And is there even a we anymore? Yeah? So when we talk about Nelson Mandela, I think the first question, before we even can answer the question of what, of whether we should be mad at him, is which Mandela? Right? There were 4 Mandelas, yeah? There was the fiery, radical Mandela, And I put radical in quotes because I don't think there's anything radical about believing in non-racism. But there was a fiery, radical Mandela. And this was a Mandela who was prepared, of course, to die for his country. But we often forget he was also prepared to kill for his country. Yeah? So this was the first Mandela, the one who went to jail. The second Mandela was what I call a principled pragmatist. This was a person who 6 times, was offered release from jail. And he knew that he was more powerful and more dangerous inside jail than he was outside. Yeah? So that's the second Mandela. The third Mandela, Utata, the grandfather, right? The man that the world embraced. The one who we will cynically say was a teddy bear. The one who went on Oprah and was hugged by every single celebrity, who Naomi Campbell had access to, right? So that's the third Mandela. And then, of course, there was a fourth Mandela who we seldom talk about, but who I think was such an interesting man. And that was a social justice activist who, in the last decade of his life, decided that he was going to stand outside the gates of power and speak up when things went wrong. Yeah? So this was the Mandela who put on the Treatment Action Campaign t-shirt and demonstrated solidarity with people living with HIV and AIDS when that was a very difficult thing to do in our context. This was the Mandela who decided that he was going to dedicate the rest of his life to children and to the tangibles, to education, to health, to the things that you could touch and feel. Yeah? So there were 4 Mandelas. And so which Mandela should we be mad at? Because he gave us this that we are now, standing with, right? And obviously, the Mandela that many people in my generation question, the one who people say sold out, was the Mandela who was the teddy bear. What's clear when you look at all 4 Mandelas is that this was a man who decided that he would suit his response to the situation, right? So he did what needed to be done at the time. And so I think if we want to be mad at him, we have to consider that very carefully. It makes no sense to be angry at someone who was simply responding, often in a very principled way, to what needed to be done at the moment. So what then, to my second question, needs to be done today? Yeah? So what we needed 20 years ago was to not be on the verge of war. And what we needed 20 years ago was to privilege forgiveness and reconciliation. And we didn't have the last 20 years of resistance from many quarters to that behind us. So, the second question. What would he do, were he with us, today? And I think it's an interesting question. I would hope that, again, if we think about the 4 Mandelas, he would bring those to bear, right? So I think that the radical in Mandela would have stood, as he always did, unequivocally against racism. I think the pragmatist in him would have looked at some of the things that have happened in our body politic in the last few months in particular as an opportunity, a pragmatic opportunity to have a national conversation. Yeah? Just in the same way that he used a rugby game as an opportunity to demonstrate forgiveness. I think there are some different lessons that we need to be drawing from some of these racist events, and so I hope that he would have looked at them as an opportunity to have a more difficult set of conversations. So that, I think, would be the second response. The third response, I think, might have been to chastise rather than forgive the young people who have been involved in some of these events. And chastise isn't a horrible word, right? That I think we understand that chastising is saying that what you are doing is wrong, but that he also, I think, would have been committed to explaining and understanding the social context in which these acts emerge. And then I think that the social activist, again, you can see this is the one that energizes me, right? So I think the social activist in Madiba would have tried to complicate the frame a little bit, complicate from what we typically see on the media. So one of my favorite quotes, it's too much words, but the most important bit is the first sentence. The function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And so I think part of what's been happening is that we have been distracted by racism. We've been distracted by the overt acts, the ones that stand on the surface, and that we haven't focused enough on what's happening underneath. And so I think that what happens with racism is it distracts us from the indignity of no toilets. It distracts us from the humiliation of no school books. It distracts us from the unacceptability of young black students leaving school and being unable to find a job. Yeah? And so I would hope that Madiba, the social activist in him, might have tried to steer us towards that conversation. But part of why it's easy to get distracted is because there's a very real extent to which, although poverty remains a predominantly black phenomenon in our country, the conversation about racism has begun to take the shape of white victimization. Yeah? And so far too often, I think white people feel as though there has been a rise in black racism, what they call black racism, and that they're being made to feel guilty for the past. So we hear often, why can't we just stop talking about apartheid? Yeah, this refrain is often. I want to give you an example. A few weeks ago, I was in a meeting, about 5 or 6 of us sitting around the table. It was around a very particular project. So everyone in that meeting was there for a very specific reason. There was a young white woman in the meeting. On the surface, we had a lot in common, right? She's educated, she's well-traveled, so lots in common. After I made a few inputs, she said she seemed really excited about me in a way that was strange, right? So after I made a few comments, she said, wow, you have a lot of really interesting things to say. But everybody in the meeting, small meeting, had very interesting things to say, right? So I ignored that one, and then we continued to talk, and then she said, this is going to be a really important project because I know that a lot of young white men, a lot of the white men who come to this campus and finish, have a lot of job insecurity. It's not going to be easy for them to get a job, given their skin color in this country. So I could tell that she wasn't trying to be patronizing, and she wasn't trying to be provocative. This was not an attempt to have a fight at all, yeah? And that's a really interesting part. And so my colleague, another black woman, said, actually, that's just not true, yeah? And she seemed really surprised. And it isn't true, right? So this is the fact. The fact is that black South Africans earn 1/6 of what white South Africans do. And that this isn't just a historical hangover, right? That incomes for white households increased by 88% in the last decade, right? So where we are going versus where we've been, the trajectory is not looking good right now, neither in race relations or in terms of economic disparities, which hew closely to race. So the empathetic part of me really gets her. I understand, I know that it's hard to be destabilized and to be a white person in a majority black country and to have had the way in which you've been raised questioned, or you perceive that that's being questioned constantly. So I get it. But I suppose that I also think that I want some empathy too. And it feels like a really one-way conversation. So the next and last question is then, that I was posing in my speeches. So what are we going to do, right? Because one of the disadvantages of having had the Mandelas as our leaders is that we always look to them for the answers, right? So what are our answers? And I think the choices we face are very stark. We have 2 choices. The one is that we continue in the path that we are, which is that we accept that we are living side by side, have full access to education, full access to the same schools, to the same hospitals, etc., but that we're not going to really engage with each other, right? We respect the Constitution, we won't be violent, but that's it. And the second option is that we try the path of embracing. And at the moment, we are betwixt and between. We haven't said that we've given up on embracing, but our behavior is showing that we've given up on embracing. And so I get slammed all the time, especially in my column, for being very strong in terms of my language, and people accuse me of being all manner of things, which I think I am not. But despite that, I have to say that I feel that we can't give up on the second path, right? That Madiba believed in that for a very particular reason, and that it's really, really important that we not give up. And there are risks to both paths. And the risk to the one path, of course, is that we get hurt. But it seems to me that if we don't follow the path of embracing, trust will continue to diminish, and we've got a race war on our hands. So I want to leave you with one thought, that we must either live together like brothers and sisters, which is from Martin Luther King, or we must perish together like fools. Thank you.